Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the course. Today, we're going to focus on Marxian and decolonial economics, two related fields, but not entirely related. And you'll see what I mean in a bit. Let's get right into this and start with the Marxian economics. So let's look at this guy, Karl Marx, who of course is quite famous. And what we want to look at is the theoretical origins of Marx. Specifically, we want to see what was this world that Marx inhabited and what was he looking at, to what empirical observations was he making that led him to the type of economic theories that he developed. Well, we'll remember from a lot of our discussion already that Marx was living in this time, a time of great change, the time of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and really a change from feudal society in Europe to what would we call a modern industrial capitalist society. So this is Marx, and this is the kind of world he was looking at. Right here we've got on the right, we've got a picture of this massive change. This is meant to depict peasants who had before this time lived on the land, made their own food, living in a feudal system, and for generations they lived in the countryside producing food. And this is the removal of the peasants from the farmland, or what we know as the enclosure movement, where they enclosed this farmland, made it into private property that hadn't existed anymore. Before this time, private property in land didn't really exist. Creation of private property in land, these wealthy merchants, merchant capitalists purchased it and removed peasants en masse from the land, creating a lot of people who didn't know how they were going to survive. At the same time, over on our picture on the left, I can remove Marx and this writing for a moment here. You see a lot of people, of course, started to congeal around factories that were newly built things. These wealthy capitalists built factories to produce goods. They needed workers. So the people who were removed from the countryside went to work in these factories. And it wasn't a good situation. Of course, the mass removal of people from their means of even survival meant you had a lot of desperate people and a lot of poor people trying to get jobs at very few factories. So Marx had a term he used for that. He described it as a reserve army, a large army of unemployed people there just being desperate. How were they acting? They were acting desperately. They were robbing. They were trying to get food any way that they could, out competing each other for jobs as best they could. And when they were hired, they were often hired for even less than a wage that would sustain their own life and livelihood. So this is the Industrial Revolution. That Industrial Revolution was a technological breakthrough using sort of machines and production line ideas to increase economic output. But it also resulted in a new class division of labor, according to Marx. And you can really see why he would be focusing on this in this time. There were rich people who bought the land and kicked people off the land, kicked the poor people off the land. There were rich people who built factories and exploited workers, making them work in harsh conditions, the harmful conditions, for very little pay. So he saw society dividing at that time into two groups, and of course he famously called them the bourgeoisie. That's the capitalists, the owners of the means of production. He would say the means of production are the resources needed to produce anything, the factory itself, the land, the trees, the wood, the steel, the iron. Those are the means of production. So the bourgeoisie are those who just own the means of production, and that's how they made their income, was from that ownership. And then the proletariat, that's the workers. You have here the bourgeoisie, capitalists versus the workers. And the capitalists only made money, it seemed, by exploiting those workers. And you could see how Marx would come to these conclusions looking at the society that he was studying at that time, at that early industrial revolution. It was increasing labor exploitation and extreme inequality. Here's an interesting graph that shows it. This is a graph that's depicting something called Engels' pause, and you can see Engels' pause written in here. And Engels was, of course, the famous co-writer of Marx. Marx and Engels, for example, co-wrote the Communist Manifesto. So this is an observation that Engels made in collaboration with Marx. And let's look at what this is. This blue line is the output per worker. How much economic output was being created per worker over the time of the early period of the Industrial Revolution. Now let's look at this. 1770, here was your output per worker. It's fairly stable. All of a sudden, around 1780, output per worker is increasing. This is that technological advancement of the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the factory and some machines to aid human labor in factories. Okay, so that's and steam power, powered by coal especially. That's all part of that scientific revolution, really, that caused the Industrial Revolution. And as you can see, consistently, GDP, this is GDP, but output per worker grew at a fairly consistent rate, and we have it up until 1910, 1905-ish here. So you can see really the impact of that technological change of the Industrial Revolution. Increased productivity per worker in economic terms. This pink line, however, is, I should say before I go to the pink line, see it starts to get jumping around up here once you get above 1870, this line. I would just ignore that, look at the main trajectory. There's a lot of data noise and less precise data in earlier times, which makes a smoother curve. So I wouldn't really look at that movement of the line so much, but just the general trajectory. So now let's go down to this pink line, which is the historical real wage. That's wages adjusted for inflation. Okay, and here we see the wages around 20. Well, on this scale, it's 20 on this scale. And you can see that up until around 1830, 1840, really, the wages didn't increase. All of a sudden, so the Industrial Revolution hit, increased output, but for some reason, wages didn't increase. And that is Engels' pause. Wages stagnated, stayed the same at the same low level for these peasants / proletariat, while people who owned factories, presumably those capitalists, were getting all of the money from the output that was related to the Industrial Revolution. And you can see that output continued. After this period, which is about 50 years, Engels' pause, what happened is that workers started to get united. They started creating more unions and arguing that they should have higher wages, taxation of wealthy, be supplied with more services, etc., etc. Sort of a bottom-up democratization, you could say, started to happen. And through that, the workers got some more power, and they were able to see their wages start to finally increase 50 years or so after the Industrial Revolution really began. But if you do notice, even though they did finally manage to get those increases, still productivity was increasing faster than their wages were increasing. So it still was an exploitative system in Marxian terms. Interestingly, you see around the year 1900, the turn of the century, those gains made by the workers in this area, getting more money for all the a larger portion of economic output, those gains turned around and workers went down. This is sort of a first neoclassical revolution when the economy was redesigned, sort of wealthy capitalists took power back over of government and cut taxes and kind of redesigned a anti-worker, pro-capitalist economy. Not that different than what happened in the 1980s that we've already discussed another time. And you can see workers' share of output falls. All this time, though, in the Industrial Revolution, this growth of output per worker continues. So what does that mean? Well, first, growth in output looks like it's a technological thing as opposed to a system thing. In the early time, you could call that very neoclassical based economics, very pro-capitalist and anti-worker economics, and the economy was growing at a particular rate. Then you have a time in which worker power gets more entrenched and workers are able to get higher wages, a bigger part of that economic output. Didn't really impact the economic output. As a matter of fact, it could have accelerated that economic output a little bit, as you see here. But it didn't take away from the economics of the world to have workers get paid more. Then workers get paid less. It doesn't really impact the rate of increase of economic output. So it's almost like that economic output might have been a technological thing, a scientific thing, and the policies didn't really matter as far as how much they impacted productivity, GDP per worker. But the important part here is you see exploitation, then workers get together and organize, and there's less exploitation of workers. Then again, more exploitation of workers as those capitalists come to control the government and repress workers. And that's the story that Marx tells, and those are his types of observations, especially the earlier part of this story, and people following Marx, tracked that second part. It should be noted that in this Engels pause, life expectancy actually declined for workers in the heart of the Industrial Revolution in the UK. So it was a really harsh time. The Industrial Revolution increased productivity, but did not increase general welfare of the nation. There was that pause. People started to have shorter lives and having less access to things that made them have healthier lives and good well-beings. And that was a particularly devastating part and horrific looking part of human history. So if you're Karl Marx and you're looking at that and you're a historian and analyzing this and an economist, you're analyzing this, you're saying, oh boy, capitalism looks really bad, right? So that's the origins of those types of theory. Marx followed Adam Smith and Ricardo, as well as earlier economists and political economists, in using the labor theory of value. So now the labor theory of value basically said all economic value is created by work, people doing something. It's not really, and this is easy to confuse, it's not really a claim that prices on the market are based on human work. Prices on the market are just market prices, and they're only loosely based on what was the real value of the good. And Marx would use the term use value to discuss the real value of the good. Like, what is it really good for? Prices for some things can go up and down, but in the end of the day, this hammer I have is only good for a certain thing. That's its use. So that's the value of it. What is it useful for? Okay, so this labor theory of value is the claim that everything useful in the economy is created by human labor. That value, that use value, is created by human labor. Let's go for an example. This is very easy. You got some rocks, right? That's in the world, and we're imagining that those are things that people can just pick up, rocks. That rock has little economic value until human labor is used to transform it into a hammer or an axe. If you have an early stone tool axe, you know that all of the value of that axe was created by work, right? You could say, yes, the environment itself created this, and that's a very ecological economics thing to say, but we're taking that out of the equation right now, and we're saying, okay, there's resources around. The only thing that makes value of those resources is humans doing work on them. In this case, fashioning a rock into a hammer. That makes it a hammer. That's an economically valuable instrument. It can be used to create more value, more productivity, etc., etc. Similarly, a tree is just there, and it's not something of economic value until a human makes lumber of it. And then they can sell that lumber, they can use that lumber, that's the use value of it. So that human labor makes that tree into a valuable thing for humans. It's a very human-centric way of looking at the world, of course. Now, the means of production, we've already talked about this a little bit. Means of production are just those physical things that it takes to make something, everything other than the work, right? So a hammer, a saw, lumber, these examples that we've already used, those are called capital. That's the capital that it takes to make something, or the means of production. And you can almost switch those terms in a lot of Marxian writing. The means of production, what does it take to make stuff? So if you follow this argument that everything of value is made from human labor, then the means of production are embodied human labor, and that's a Marxian term. They're embodied labor. If you have a hammer, you can look at that and say, that's somebody's work I have here, right? Somebody's work made that, so that is somebody's work embodied in a useful tool because somebody made that. That's really important because it suggests that everything of value is just labor in one form or another. And if you take that labor, if you take that value or any of that value, you're actually stealing that labor from a person. You're stealing that work. You have to, if I made a hammer and you take that hammer from me, you're stealing my hammer, right? But if I have a hammer and you buy it from me for $3 and then go into town and sell it for $4, you've actually stolen $1 from me, because the real value of that thing I made is $4, and you just used a trick of understanding the economy a little bit more to take some of my rightfully due value that I made in creating that artifact, that tool. Okay, so taking money when you haven't done any work for it is exploitation, according to Marx. It's stealing, right? Let's put this into an example using a factory, right? Okay, so let's say here, we've got these means of production, this hammer, this wood, these saws. Those are means of production. So they are embodied labor. Somebody just made those. That's where they get their value. Somebody made them. If you take those means of production or capital and you mix them with more labor, you can build something, a factory. But if you'll notice, this factory is also just embodied labor. It's entirely made from work. So who rightfully should have the value of that factory, should own that factory? Well, that's these workers. This worker here and the workers who made the tools in the first place should somehow own this factory if you live in a just world, according to Marx. And that factory itself, you can mix that with more work, more workers, more labor, and you come up with products in the factory, right? Those products might even be hammers and wood and saws. And if you can see in this example, every commodity, this is a commodity, these little boxes are commodities coming out of the factory, and the factory itself, all of that stuff is just made by workers. So taking some of that stuff, taking some of the value of that factory or the value of those products without doing work yourself, that's exploitation. Okay, so then Marxian theory gets into this idea that profits without work are exploitation. And you get sort of, these are classic, communist type cartoons of very wealthy capitalists who don't do any work other than owning money, just sort of taking advantage of the poor, right? So you might be asking, well, what about managers, right? If you owners might also be managers, and isn't that valuable economic work to manage and coordinate economies? Yes, it is. So Marx would suggest managers should be paid the value of their work. What is the value that they contribute to that good, the creation of that good? Of course, managers should be paid. But where Marx had a problem is with money. If you're sitting there back and just putting your money as an investment somewhere, and you make money because your money is there, you're not doing work. You're not doing the management. You're not making the product. That is where the exploitation is. Making money just by owning money. Making money just by owning capital. Making money just by owning the means of production in this case. Okay. So that's exploitation, right? If a worker is paid less than the value they create through their labor, and somebody who just has invested money takes that value, that's stolen according to Marxian economics. And of course, that whole enclosure movement in Britain that made that big army of unemployment, the purpose of that politically was to create desperate workers from which capitalists who own the means of production are able to exploit economic value. That is, they can make workers work for less than they deserve, stealing the value of the goods that they create. And that's kind of the core of Marxian economics right there. So capitalists steal profits from workers. But what do they use those profits for? Well, they use it to reinvest and steal more money from workers, according to Marxian theory, but some other things as well. They will use the profits here to fund ideology. They owned newspapers. They owned the means of ideological production as well as the means of physical production. So they owned the newspapers. They owned sports teams, and they can create mass distractions so people just worry about following sports teams, for example, or watching movies later in order, and they worry about that and what's next on Netflix, for example, or what's next from the Toronto Maple Leafs or whatever it happens to be. The workers focus on that and don't notice essentially that they're being stolen from all the time. They spend money on indoctrination through education programs, et cetera, and they just buy the government with their money. That's what profits are actually for, is mass manipulation and the making of more profits to make more money for capitalists. And capitalism is just this system that wants to grow and make more money for money all the time. There it is, Marx's idea of capitalism in a very simplistic form. Another important element of Marxian economics is this idea, historical materialism. That's the idea that the economy drives history forward. And embedded in that is the idea that there's always contradictions in any economic system. There were contradictions in the feudal system that we won't talk about that drove that feudal system eventually to collapse. And there are similarly contradictions and conflicts within the capitalist system which would cause that system to collapse. But Marx thought that capitalism was an important step in history. It was part of history and it had to happen. He wasn't saying that capitalism shouldn't happen, and that's something that people often forget. But he did say there are contradictions and conflicts and difficulties in capitalism that will eventually cause it to collapse and lead to something new. So what are these contradictions? Well, okay, what is capitalism? It's a system based on private ownership of those means of production. The bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat in that system. So this creates an industrial and economic base for an advanced and affluent society. It produces a lot of stuff, more than enough stuff than we need to have a good and affluent society for everybody on Earth. But the problem with capitalism is it does that by creating inequality and instability. So while capitalism is a great engine for production and it creates more than enough goods for people to survive well on Earth, unfortunately, those profits from those goods are always stolen by those capitalists, creating so much inequality. And that inequality creates instability. So you can have a society like we live in now, in which we produce far more goods than we need as a species, for everybody to equally live a decent life. But we have masses of poverty, poor people, huge issues of poverty and economic instability as well at the same time. This, according to Marx, is what capitalism has to lead to, because it's got that contradiction of the bourgeoisie investing and taking money from that proletariat. It, it leads not only just to economic instability, market crashes, and those extreme business cycles, but also political instability, which is related to economic instability anyway. You'll have revolutions and things like that, right? Eventually, Marx said that this contradiction in capitalism will lead to the economic collapse of that system, right? And the idea is that once workers see past the distractions and all that propaganda that the capitalists are throwing out there, those workers will say, wait a second, there's way more of us, and they'll just overthrow the very few wealthy capitalists that are running the system and install something called socialism. Now, socialism had a very specific definition according to Marx. Socialism is private ownership of the means of production being abolished. So you don't own private property anymore. Companies aren't owned by individuals anymore. But you still own the product of the work and the things you make. You still own that value of your labor, right? So if you work and have a job and make money, then that's still yours. You just don't make money anymore from just having money. That's sort of the definition of socialism that's activated in a lot of Marxism. The economy under socialism would be planned scientifically by a bureaucracy of paid managers, right? And workers still get to choose their occupations and things like that theoretically, but that economy is planned scientifically. Okay, what do our scientists essentially and our economists say is the best way to organize this economy? We'll do it this way. How many workers do we need in that field? How many in that field? Okay, let's hire those workers. We'll make sure everybody's taken care of pretty well and give them good wages, et cetera, et cetera. But workers are paid according to the value they produce. And this is important because it's argued that under capitalism, of course, workers are getting paid less. So under socialism, workers would get paid more, and this would equal the value of their labor, right? What the political system would be democratic political rule by workers. Everybody is a worker now, though, right? They've kind of abolished capitalism. They've abolished capitalists as well. People who make money only by having money and investing it, those are gone. Everybody is a worker. You only make money if you work. You make money or according to the amount of work that you make, I should say. So the value of that work, that's how you make your money in a socialist system. Okay, so what this does is creates ever more value and an affluent society for everybody. The idea is this socialism is just a better form of management of the economy. It's more scientific. It will create more good and it won't have those instabilities and inequalities that capitalism has, until eventually you'll get so much good, so much wonderful output, so much equality that you sort of communism automatically happens. That's when people don't have to work so much, and even if you can't work, you're getting paid and things like that. So this evokes a key sort of point of thought about markets. And Marx is implying that markets should be replaced with scientific management. That is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is really the scientific management of the economy by experts, and then managers are given jobs and they manage it through large institutions on down. Bureaucratic and scientific, rational, sometimes people would say rational management of economic institutions. That's what's suggested in this Marxian theory. Okay, so that's Marx's idea. Here's Marx here, and here's his idea, right? Since markets are volatile and inefficient and exploitative, and they're also prone to collapse, economies should be managed scientifically. Now, let's bring in this guy again, Friedrich von Hayek, just to counterpoint Marx here. Friedrich von Hayek said, no, markets are amazing because they deliver information through prices. You get information of all of the states of the world, and if a drought happens in Africa, the price of cocoa beans will go up. And look, you've got that information of the drought just through the price of the cocoa bean going up, because the drought created less cocoa beans and caused the price to go up. Friedrich von Hayek, this famous neoliberal economist, neoclassical economist, um, Austrian economist, really argued that the market is an amazing way to transfer information, right? Markets are near perfect channels of nuanced information that no rational human or group of humans could ever conceive of the complexities of a market. So bureaucracy will always fail because the market is smarter than humans, even if they're scientists and being very rational. That was Hayek's argument. Now, here's another guy, another capitalist we call often he's an economic sociologist, Max Weber. We've seen him a number of times. You can't talk really about the economy without going back to Weber once or twice. He said, no, wait, actually, scientific management is destined to be the future of humanity. It is just much more efficient if we use our brains, solve the problem mathematically and scientifically, calculate the solutions, and manage it with our tools. Maybe our tools are AI. Maybe our tools are some sort of computation similar to AI. Decentralized markets are just too complicated. There's not enough information. They could do wonky things on their own. They need to be managed scientifically. And as a matter of fact, management is the future of humanity. Bureaucracy is the future of humanity. We will come to manage our economy scientifically. Why? Because those companies and countries who don't manage their economies scientifically, they will fail. And all that will be left are those that did effectively manage their economies through science and evidence and bureaucracy. So who's right here? Is bureaucracy really inefficient? Or are markets really inefficient and unstable? What do we do as far as economic management? And how do you plan your future as a business or as a worker according to that? Well, it might be surprising for you to know that actually it's coming to seem that Max Weber was probably the one who was correct here. That sort of bureaucratic management is the way that the world and history has tended to go. That might seem kind of wacky to you unless you look at things sort of scientifically and look at the actual evidence. So let's look at that. It seems that actually the economy already is run almost entirely by bureaucracies. You can see that because sort of 43 of the largest 200 economic entities in the world are governments. That maybe shouldn't surprise you. The US government especially is probably the largest economic entity in the world. And that's a bureaucracy, right? Okay, but this might surprise you a bit more. All 200 of the largest economic entities of the world are bureaucracies. All of them are bureaucracies. Let's look at some of the largest bureaucracies in the world to get an idea of this. So what's the largest bureaucracy in the world? The government of the United States of America. Not a huge surprise. That's a bureaucracy, scientifically managed as best as they can. It's not perfect, of course. Here's number 9, the government of Canada, right? Yeah, probably the government of Canada would be up there, one of the largest economic organizations in the world. Sure, number 9. Number 10, Walmart. Walmart is a bureaucracy. Think about what a bureaucracy is. Walmart is an internal organization, the 10th largest economic entity of the world, and it's a top-down dictatorship. Actually, it's not even a democratic bureaucracy. It's a dictatorship. You do what your manager says, and they do what their manager says, all the way up to the CEO. And it's scientifically planned. Where are we going to put plants? Where are we going to put stores? How many workers are we going to employ here and there? The 10th largest the 10th largest economic entity in the world is a bureaucracy, and it is Walmart. it's a corporation. And you can keep going down the list. Then you have 12. Australia, the 12th largest economic entity in the world. Toyota is number 21. These are all bureaucracies. Volkswagen, 22, bureaucracy. Russia, also a bureaucracy. India, bureaucracy. Apple, number 29, bureaucracy, right? So because of market failures, scientific data-driven bureaucratic management is efficient in government. It's also efficient in industry. It's not perfect, but obviously every corporation in the world wouldn't manage their affairs via bureaucracy if it wasn't sort of the most efficient way that they could do it. And you're doing this within a capitalist system. So bureaucracy seems to be the organizing principle of the world, and weirdly maybe sounding, bureaucracy is the organizing principle of capitalism itself, right? Now, you can notice here, wow, these are bureaucracies, but they're very different. A government is different from a corporation, for example, and Walmart is different from Apple, and Toyota is different from Apple, and whatnot. Yes, for sure, there are very many differences in organizations and bureaucracies. They can have kind of different goals, but at the end of the day, it is scientific, rational management, not according to the market, but according to what people think through research is the better way to advance given the goals. Now, the goals of the corporations are very different from the goals of the government. For example, you've got, say, Canada and Walmart, 9 and 10. The goal of Canada, presumably, is furthering the well-being interest of Canadians, right? The goal of Walmart is make profit, okay? So their goals are different, but the way that they manage themselves internally to achieve those goals are not different. They're both bureaucratic management, right? So we can think of, okay, so maybe the issue isn't whether it's bureaucracy or not. Maybe the issue of if we're doing the economy right is, are our bureaucracies accountable and responsive? And that's probably a good way of looking at it. You know, it's when people think of the government, they often think of an irresponsive and kind of unaccountable bureaucracy that they can't understand what's going on inside of. So people have done studies of different bureaucracies, from NVIDIA and Tesla to the government of Australia, for example. And what have they found? Well, neither sector, whether it's a government bureaucracy or a business bureaucracy, neither are more or less accountable. You can have very obscure, non-transparent businesses, and you can have very obscure, non-transparent governments that don't respond to citizens. You can have businesses that don't respond well to consumers, especially if those are very powerful businesses. They might not have to respond to consumers because they control the market. They're monopolists, for example. So sometimes governments can be more or less responsive to citizens and transparent, and sometimes businesses can be more or less. There's no real one that's universally more accountable. One type of bureaucracy that's universally more accountable, a government or a business. Governments have elections, right? So theoretically, the governments are actually accountable to the entire population of voters. Businesses don't. Businesses do actually have elections, but those elections are only done according to who owns what in the company. So shareholders have elect CEOs, for example, according to how much money they own, what percent of the economy, of the size of that business that those shareholders own. So there's different types of elections in businesses compared to governments. It does seem that governments, yeah, they're responsive. They have to, in democratic governments, they have to respond to the citizens more than a company would. Research suggests that neither government-owned corporations or privately owned corporations are more efficient. So there you go. It's not necessarily that bureaucracies are good or bad. Some bureaucracies are better than others, and that it doesn't matter if that bureaucracy is in a corporation, in the private market, or if it's a government. Either one of those can be irresponsive and inefficient, or very efficient and very responsive. And this is just a picture so you can visualize here the 50 largest companies in the world. Some of the most largest bureaucracies in the world then are pictured in this picture. There you go. So this brings us to another question related to Marxism. Democracy versus dictatorship versus socialism versus capitalism. There's a lot of emotional laden ideas when you start talking about this sort of Marxian theory, or even start to bring politics at all into economics. We're talking about government here compared to businesses, for example. Once you start doing that, you start getting a lot of emotional arguments with a lot of preconceived ideas. And a lot of those arguments are circulating around these ideas: democracy, dictatorship, socialism, capitalism. So, first point to make about these is that classification is difficult, but there have been about as many capitalist dictatorships as socialist dictatorships, right? So capitalism, it's often assumed that capitalism goes with democracy and socialism goes with dictatorship. That's not true. It's kind of half and half, right? You can have capitalist dictatorships, many have been that, and you can have socialist democracies. There's also very many arguments about what freedom even is. For example, here's Milton Friedman, famous neoclassical economist, neoliberal economist, and he argued that capitalism is money, having private property. Capitalism. Freedom is having private property, and nobody can take your private property. And then here's a communist sort of propaganda photo: fight for communism, fight for freedom. Oh, communism is freedom. Why is communism freedom in this argument, while capitalism is freedom in the other? Well, let's see. The communist argument is that freedom from alienation, economic necessity, and exploitation and forced work. That's what freedom is, right? Whereas Milton Friedman says, no, freedom is the ability to own your property and have nobody be able to take it from you. People often say communism, however, in popular discourse when they really mean dictatorship, and that confuses things. Because the first is actually an economic term, communism. The last is a political term, dictatorship, and they get mixed up all the time in public discourse. So, example: Russia was a feudal dictatorship, then a communist dictatorship, and now it's a capitalist dictatorship. It's always been a dictatorship. Its economic form has changed, and sometimes it's been more or less dictatorial. But in a lot of Russian history, anyways, I shouldn't say always, a lot of Russian history, it has been a dictatorship. Now it just happens to be a dictatorship in the capitalist form, right? So that economic form does not have to correspond with a political system. We're going to leave this because it could be an entire other course to discuss all these nuances. What we're going to leave aside is, as much as we can, is this political argument about what is freedom and whatnot. We're going to try and focus, when we're looking at Marxian analysis and sort of looking at the economy in sort of more Marxian terms in this lecture here, we're just going to look at the economy. Right? And I'm not going to talk about, okay, the economy was this way, oh, but freedom, or, oh, look, communist countries have more freedom according to this definition than other countries. We're not going to do this. We're just going to try and look at the data as far as money is concerned, so we can avoid all of these complex, emotionally laden political arguments about democracy, dictatorship, and how they relate to communism, capitalism, and things like that. So that's how we're going forward from here as we analyze sort of Marxian economies, I suppose, and bureaucratic economies as well. There's a pretty big problem when it comes to analyzing how well socialist or communist, especially communist systems perform. And the problem is that there are very few examples, and of course, the ones that we have are very imperfect. But every economy is imperfect, so we'll have to make do. We can get rid of analyzing communist societies because that's never happened before. So, but socialism has happened before. So, we'll have to kind of muddle through the socialist economy examples to see what sort of insights we can have on how this form of bureaucratic management of the society, of the economy has worked or not worked. Okay, so let's go through. We will be going through those imperfect examples. Um, to understand why they're imperfect, you have to remember that Marxian theory explained that societies have to go through a period of capitalism and then advanced capitalism before those contradictions in capitalism appear, and then the system collapses and becomes controlled by the workers, essentially, right? And bureaucratically and scientifically controlled economies come out of that process. So, I mean, socialist economies were supposed to be capitalist before they became socialist, with an already advanced, highly productive economy in place, built there through a capitalist stage of historical development, right? Um, so the main examples that we have of socialist countries, though, I'm thinking China, North Korea, Cuba, the Soviet Union, they were just feudal societies that didn't have really a capitalist society at all, and they went straight to not communism, as I write here. They went straight to socialism. So there's no capitalist period. So it's not really how it's supposed to go, so to speak. So that's one caveat. These societies had to grow from zero feudal societies, just being feudal societies, and kind of compete with already advanced capitalist societies that were in the economy. Were in the global economy when they started their socialist experiments, as we could say. Um, the communist societies were to be judged according to fairness and provision of well-being universal to everyone. So you were supposed to judge those according to how well everybody equally was doing. Um, but those societies, those communist or socialist societies that came into power through various revolutions, say in China or the Soviet Union, were too small. They couldn't adequately provide for everybody in their economy because they had to grow first. They weren't large enough, and they didn't have high enough output because they didn't go through this sort of industrial revolution. So what you found is, after, say, the Soviet Revolution in Russia, you've got a feudal country that all of a sudden is a socialist country and somehow has to build capitalist infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, even before they're able to afford kind of this socialism that they might have had in mind. So that's kind of imperfect. And another source of imperfection is North Korea and Cuba are using these examples. They're tiny countries, and they're in a huge, big economic and political world. It's arguable that they don't even control their own economic destiny, because just the big players, the United States and China, for example, can dominate them. And really, the US and China and the global economy really decide what the Cuban economy does. For example, Cuba's been blockaded by the United States for decades. Therefore, the United States is really the one entity that's influential on what the Cuban economy can do. So that's a problem. Okay, so with these issues in place, we will go ahead and analyze these countries as how their economies have done, understanding that yes, they're imperfect examples, but in the actual world, we don't tend to get perfect examples anyway. So let's just go ahead with the imperfect examples. Okay, how have they performed? It's impossible to really know, as I suggested. The let's look at these small ones with that caveat of, do they really control their own destinies anyway? For example, it's claimed that the U.S. has attempted 600 times during the life of Fidel Castro, the then dictator of Cuba. It's estimated that there were 600 attempts sponsored by the United States on his life. And of course, that whole island was surrounded by a military blockade and a trade blockade from the Americans throughout its entire existence, essentially. So, how can you really take measures from that? Well, let's just try anyway, right? Here's Cuba. GDP per capita is $10,000. That's not adjusted for cost of living so much, but it's pretty low. The US is somewhere around 70,000 by the same measure, 75,000 probably. But the lifespan of Cubans is actually higher than the average American lifespan, so they must be doing something right. They have 9 doctors per capita, which is significantly more than they have in the United States, if that's a metric that matters to you. Infant mortality is the same as it is. So the number of babies that die at birth is the same in Cuba as it is in the United States. So it's not doing so bad. And it's ranked 6th in the world in education. The United States is maybe the first or second in the world in education. So Cuba actually, even though those caveats are there, it's a poor country as far as GDP is concerned. The other indicators don't look so bad for Cuba as a socialist planned economy. North Korea, the numbers don't look so well for North Korea. GDP per capita, $1,500 compared to $75,000 per year per capita in the United States. That's not good. Lifespan is 74. That's 4 years lower than the United States, 5 years lower than Cuban lifespan. Doctors per capita actually is higher in in North Korea than the United States. The infant mortality rate is pretty high in North Korea, though, compared to the US and other countries. And education ranking is really low for North Korea. Now, there's all sorts of particular arguments you can get over these numbers and who counts them up and who ranks them, but we're just trying to do the best we can with the most available public data right now. So as far as is concerned, the smaller socialist economies, planned socialist economies, Cuba you might be able to say that it looks okay economically, and North Korea not so much. Again, we're holding aside any ideas of like freedom this and freedom that, whose freedom is real freedom, and a discussion of political systems, which is better or not, because I don't want to get in those arguments right now. It's an economics course. Okay, so let's look at a bigger example, the Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union. Okay, here's an interesting graph of gross domestic product per capita of the Soviet Union at purchasing power parity. These are important things. We're looking at per capita GDP and at purchasing power parity. So we're adjusting, of course, for how much it costs to buy things in that country. So we're really measuring what you can get for those average dollars that an average person makes in this economy. And this is mapped from 1970 to 2014 here, and you can see it's color-coded. The red line is when Russia was called the Soviet Union, and this is the Russian part of the Soviet Union, and the blue part is when it's this is the Soviet Union. It's not only Russia, I should say, all the countries of the Soviet Union. And then the blue is the former Soviet Union countries measured in the size of their GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing costs in the local economy. Okay, so you can see this is from 1970, so kind of well after the Soviet Revolution, the economy is growing at quite a large rate. Here from 1970 till around 1989. This is, of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed around 1989. What happened when the Soviet system, the socialist economy, was replaced with a capitalist economy? Total collapse of growth, negative growth. The economy ceased to grow to grow and then went backward. Then eventually, about 10 years later, it started to grow again under this capitalist dictatorship regime that kind of endures until today. So what can we see here? It was growing pretty well. Capitalism kind of ruined it, and then it started to grow again, though, under capitalism. But one thing we can do is if we draw the growth rate of the Soviet Union straight up, we can see that the economy of the former Soviet Union still has not caught up to where it kind of would be if it kept growing at that rate of the former Soviet Union. So it looks like that planned economy, socialist economy under the Soviet Union was highly productive. Remember, they took, in the early 20th century, a feudal society and built an entire industrial economy with it, and it looked to be very quickly growing. With a big caveat, the whole thing collapsed in 1989. Not going to go into the political reasons for that. There was a reason, though, and it collapsed. Whether that was a weakness in the economy or a political thing, that's not within our realm to analyze here. So it did collapse. It grew spectacularly well and then collapsed. So it was a good economy that collapsed. Take that from that what you will. GDP per capita in 1917, that's the year of the Russian Revolution, was about $500 per person. Like, that's a feudal society, right? This was a feudal agricultural society, really. But it grew to 14,500 by 1989. This is a growth rate of about 4.7%. In that same period, the United States grew only by 2%. So Soviet Russia was far outpacing the United States over the 20th century as far as economic growth is concerned. So that looks pretty good for the socialist planned economy there. It actually took the United States 200 years to go from about $500 per capita to $1,400. The Soviet Union did that in only 72 years. Seems pretty good. But again, it collapsed. What other metric can we use? Life expectancy seems like a good one. Here's the Russian Revolution here. Pretty bad life expectancy. I mean, yeah, the First World War is in here, suppressing life expectancies, and the Second World War, so you have to take that into account. But it does look like after the Second World War, life expectancy just skyrocketed from just before the 20th century, when it was about 30, we'll say it was 35, was average life expectancy, feudal society in Russia, till it went up over 70 pretty quick under the Soviet Socialist Republic. Okay, so life expectancy seemed to be pretty good as far as the Soviet Union is concerned. There's your data, your economic data on the success of that socialist planned economy. Let's look at the other big one, China. Here is early China growth when China had, again, another revolution occurred this time in the 1950s in a feudal society with hardly any GDP. We can probably think again of around 500 per person or even less. And what happened with China after that? Under a Marxian, more strict Marxian economic policy, planned policy, very limited. This is the red line, is China here. That's like hardly any economic growth, it looks like. We're comparing it here with Japan, though, right? That's a country in the region that's very close, an Asian economy, and Japan is growing like crazy from 1950 to 1978. Let's look at these numbers in greater detail, though. China is getting a 2.8% average of growth here, which actually isn't so bad. It just looks bad next to Japan because Japan is growing so well as a capitalist economy, sort of a Keynesian economy, actually. Keynesian capitalist economy in that time frame. Japan was growing at 7.6% on average from 1950 to 1978 here. In this period, the United States was growing about 4% on average, right? To put that in perspective of how sort of an advanced capitalist economy was doing, 4% from 1950 to around 1978. That's the Keynesian period, if you remember past lectures of the United States as well. Okay. So China did okay, actually, 2.8% growth, but compared to the capitalist world of the time, did not do that well. So let's see. There's a caveat here that this comparing to Japan might not be fair because Japan was devastated after the Second World War and was largely a planned economy, as a matter of fact, and that plan revolved around a $25 billion of reconstruction funds given to it by the Allies to rebuild that economy as a industrial powerhouse. Right, so there was massive investments coming there from the United States, especially into China, and that kind of investment into Japan, and that kind of investment did not happen in China. So it's really hard to really pull these things apart, but it does look like in early times, China didn't do as well as the sort of free market, well, Keynesian in this case. I won't call them free market because it was Keynesian kind of managed capitalism of the rest of the globe, including Japan and the United States. Let's go to a later period after 1978 and see what happened in China. Let's see. China changed its policy around that time and during the 1980s and actually more recently to become slowly more of a Marxian planned economy mixed with a Keynesian market planned economy, right? So you know what Keynesianism, we've discussed that already. China started to go toward that while still maintaining its Marxian base. And what happened? Well, here's 1980. So our last graph ended in 1978. This is 1980, and this is the total share of global GDP. This is comparing China and the United States. And as you can see, and this is adjusting for purchasing power parity, which is important to do. And as you can see, China is actually now the largest economy on earth. It's larger than the United States, according if you would once you adjust from purchasing power. They're approximately the same size, but if you adjust properly, like you should for purchasing power in their own country, China is a bigger economy now. So something happened after 1980. China wasn't a very big player. All of a sudden, it mixed Marxism with Keynesianism and seems to have gone through the roof as far as growth is concerned, compared to the United States, obviously here. Compared to Japan as well. Here is China in orange and Japan in blue around 2010. China just kind of blew past Japan as far as the size of its economy, its GDP was concerned. And it did that. Often it said, well, yes, but were the average people in China, were they benefiting from this? Maybe it was injecting capitalism and just made a few capitalists rich or something like that. Well, no, it seems like average monthly wages in China took a huge turn to the better in this period after, around the 1980s, 1990s. So much so that, say, in 1995, wages in China were about the same as Vietnam and lower than Mexico. But by 2010, the average wage for a Chinese worker is well above Mexico. Goes above Mexico and is well above Mexico by 2018 and well above Vietnam as well. So Chinese workers are getting paid more on average than Mexican and Vietnamese workers. Mexico and Vietnam are also sort of large producer industrial countries. So it makes that rely on cheap labor, so to speak. So it makes sense to compare these countries. So yeah, China's the biggest economy in the world now, and its workers are, compared to a lot of, countries, are paid better than others. So seems to be doing pretty well. What about 2024 data? It's fairly recent data. China's economic growth per capita was 5%. American economic growth was 2.8%. Japan was hardly anything. It didn't really grow. So China continues to grow much faster than the United States, it looks like. We don't know how long that will hold into the future, but this looks pretty good for the Chinese planned economy if you just look at these data. Let's look at other things. First, let's put that into perspective. We were looking at overall GDP, the size of the entire economy of China, and we looked at worker payment as something that was going up, but we're not looking at per capita GDP. Let's look at that. And it becomes pretty obvious when you look at this graph. China is this blue thing down here. China is, yes, growing after especially 2000, but it's still tiny as far as GDP per capita. In this is comparing it with the United States. So the United States, to interpret this graph, say this dotted line is holding the economy of the United States at 100%. So as holding it, imagining that the United States economy is the one you're comparing everybody to. That's that dotted line. How is China doing compared to the United States? Well, it's catching up, right? It was in 1990 about 10% the size of the United States here. Now it's about 25% in per capita terms, GDP per capita, per person. So it's catching up, but it's still got a long way to go to catch the United States as far in per capita terms. Just there's a lot more people that live in China, so as the size of the entire economy in China is larger than the economy in the United States, but on a per person basis, the Chinese economy is smaller. And you can look at some of there's some European countries in here as well. Most of the European countries have not improved their standing compared to the United States, except maybe Germany. But this is all subject to a lot of fluctuation, that United States versus Europe comparison. South Korea notably started its sort of Keynesian industrialization in amidst a sort of Keynesian market style economy in around 1965, and of course South Korea has been growing quite significantly on a per capita basis ever since. So China still has a low per capita GDP compared to the United States. So not doing so well in a per capita basis, but catching up, right? What about other indicators? What other things can we look at? Life expectancy, that's a good one. We've looked at that fairly consistently. Let's look at that. 1940, life expectancy really low. Again, similar to Russia, actually, around 35 years in China. Then when the revolution occurs, and boom, you've got pretty high life expectancy approaching 80 years in China. So they're doing pretty well as far as life expectancy. As a matter of fact, they're doing currently better than the United States is doing. The Chinese people live longer than Americans. Okay, so that's a success there. Then there's all this tech stuff, and we have been talking a lot about tech in this course because it's thought of in a lot of economic theory as the driver of GDP growth, the driver of economies. So how is China doing in that sphere? And if you read the news at all, you'll probably have seen a lot of this. I'm going to put a bunch of examples that just come across news feeds. Here's one from the CBC. China might be winning the AI race. Does it matter? So technological advancement is really important. Remember, just a few graphs ago, we were looking at the Industrial Revolution and saying, wow, it looks like that growth in the Industrial Revolution might have been just a scientific thing, a technological revolution. When we changed policy, it still kept growing at about the same rate. So maybe this tech is a big driver of innovation and economic growth and just the power of countries. If that's the case, China seems to be winning the AI race. Should we worry about that? Okay, here's from The Guardian. There is only one player. Why China is becoming a leader in green energy. We also, a while back in previous lectures, looked at evidence that actually maybe it's energy, cheap energy, that just drives economic growth. And if you can have free energy or cheaper energy, you'll be the country that grows the fastest. Essentially, we know that fossil fuel energy is very expensive compared to all other forms of energy at a per unit basis, because you have to go get that fossil fuel, you have to extract it from the ground, and you have to process it and then ship it. where, say, solar energy, once you have solar panels, you don't have to do that. Fusion, of course, nuclear fusion and other sorts of nuclear, once you build that factory, that nuclear power plant, you get a lot of energy on fairly cheaply on a per unit basis. Fossil fuels aren't the future of energy, or that's become pretty clear. China seems to be leading in that new cheap energy field. So, doing pretty well there. Despite Trump's tariffs, China's trade surplus climbs past 1 trillion. China's winning the trade war with the United States. It's United States can't seem to keep up with China as far as production and trade are concerned. How can the U.S. counter China's robotics lead? Apparently, China is leading in the robotics realm as well. China claims up to 90% cost edge in carbon capture, so clean energy, China's leading. Biotech, China's biotech studying advanced is changing the world's drug pipeline. Okay, China is leading in biotech in a stunning way, apparently. China's is the world's top carbon polluter, and it's likely to over deliver on its climate goals. So it's doing better on the new clean economy stuff. If you think that's a driver of growth or just a good thing to do, you'd want to take that into account. China breaks more records with a surge in solar and wind power. Again, it's leading on this new energy regime, which might be the fuel that fuels the entire future economy. What will China dominate next? From The Economist, this article suggests like China's just kind of winning in all the tech realm and the trade realm, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. And the future is China of the global economy. The future of the future of the global economy looks like it might be China led. China won the rare earths race. Can it stay on top? Rare earths are often talked about. These are those critical minerals, and they say the new economy, AI, robotics, tech need this rare earth thing. Renewable energy as well need all these rare earths, these critical minerals. Turns out China has maintained and developed access to a large proportion of the global's rare earths, so much so that the other countries can't really compete with the amount of rare earths and critical minerals that China has control over. So it seems to be that China's economy is doing quite well according to a lot of indicators, but as far as GDP per capita, it's still pretty low, but growing. So there's your data.